Today we will talk about liquidation preference primarily. If some of you have attended our session yesterday, we did talk about the private equity VC exit clauses and the practical issues which we face and how it is structured. There were a couple of points which we did not take up, and we kept it for today, and that is what we're going to take up. It's primarily on liquidation preference. We'll also touch upon how it works with drag rights and some of the other rights. Uh, today, in today's session, we will cover what is liquidation preference, how it is structured, what are different issues in protecting liquidation preference. Also, we will cover, is it enforceable? Can we really have liquidation preference and enforce it? Right? Have there been any cases? What are the other things you need to keep in mind? Practical things you need to keep in mind when you are trying to enforce liquidation preference. So we will take a little more this subject a little more in deep. Again, as I requested yesterday, my request to all the participants is try to keep your questions early in the sessions, in which case we can cover it while our session is on, if you're going to speak on the topic. In situation where we are actually not covered the session, we can try to cover after our session in the Q&A uh, phase. If the questions comes at the end of the session, we may not be able to cover it. Also, if there are too many questions, we may be able to cover some of them. The other, we can take it one-on-one offline. With this, let's start the session. As I told that this is a very interesting topic. We see this liquidation preference almost in all agreements. This is something which is a premise on which a private equity or a VC invest. They want to ensure that if there's an exit, then they get their money first compared to, let's say, the founders or the promoters. Also, there are various situations where there are multiple investors coming in multiple round, and the dynamics of how liquidation preference of one investor works with other investor also becomes very interesting and sometimes complex. So we will look into that. With this, let me go first to Atikant and ask her question. Let's start with the basic. What do you mean by liquidation preference? Can you just throw some light on key aspects, Atikant?
Just to get things started, as Vaibhav mentioned, the basics of liquidation preference is what I would talk. As the name suggests, this is the clause which determines the economic returns that an investor would be entitled to receive upon the occurrence of any event, which could be typically called a liquidation or a liquidity event. Those are the names that you would generally see in an investment document.
You're cracking. Can you just be louder and your microphone closer? Thank you.
Um, Let me repeat myself.
Yeah, much better.
So just to give everybody a little background as to the concept of liquidity preference, as the name suggests, this is the clause which determines the economic returns that an investor would be entitled to receive upon the occurrence of events which are typically called liquidation or liquidity events. Since it affects the right of one investor, it also ends up affecting the rights of all other shareholders of a company, which is why you'll end up seeing that this is one of the most heavily negotiated concepts in an investment documentation. And it is also a very standard provision that you will typically see in VC or early stage investments, where the interest of an investor is really to protect themselves from a downside scenario. You would not usually see this in a full-fledged, sophisticated company which has had several rounds of investments and has more of a matured share capital. If it is only going to go for an IPO in the next few years, liquidation preference is not really something that an investor would be looking at. There are different types of liquidation preference which may be agreed to between parties, and which is something my colleague Anusha would be looking into in more detail. The type of liquidation preference clause which is finally agreed to between investors and the company is really a function of the negotiating power of each party. It depends on the stage of the investment, whether it's a seed stage investment, an early stage investment, mid stage investment, or a growth investment. And also, very importantly, the performance of the company. While it's up to the parties to really determine the specific situations in which a liquidation preference right can be exercised, broadly speaking, it is typically triggered in a situation where liquidity is generated at the company level or the shareholder level. Such situations of liquidity are usually of the following kind. They include mergers, amalgamations, demergers, or in cases of change of control transactions, in cases of acquisitions, strategic sales, drag sales, etc. You would also see this in case of transfer or sale of a company's assets in majority. You would also see this in a liquidation, dissolution, insolvency, or a bankruptcy proceeding, which is really a function of Companies Act, and that is something we'll also be looking at. To put these different liquidity events into some practical scenarios, I'll take names of certain deals which have happened in the public domain so far, which would help you sort of map this against what could possibly be seen as a liquidity event, such as the Make My Trip and IBEVO merger, Ola's acquisition of Taxi for Sure, Walmart's acquisition of Flipkart. Each of these could be covered, could constitute a liquidity event in a generic scenario. Of course, what the parties would have agreed to in their respective investment agreements is really up to them. But this is what we typically see certain scenarios as playing out. An initial public offering is not usually covered in the definition of a liquidity event, only because prior to such a IPO, parties are anyway required to convert all of their preference shareholding into equity shares. So what is the difference really between a statutorily backed liquidation preference and a contractually agreed liquidation preference? So the Companies Act does not go into all of the nuances that we have just discussed now, but it does recognize that preference shareholders have a certain preferential right over the proceeds from any liquidation or bankruptcy situation. It does not, however, go into any of the other aspects that we have just discussed. Parties can, however, decide to tailor make any preferential rights for themselves under their investment documents, so long as they're able to carve out the applicability of the relevant section of the Companies Act, which solely rests this preferential rights broadly on all preferential shareholders. With this, I think I will pass it on to Anusha. If you could please run us through different types of liquidation preference that are incorporated in investment agreements.
Thanks, Atikant. So as Atikant just explained, a liquidation preference is a contractual right which is agreed to between investors and shareholders in a company. So in the many years, we've seen various types of liquidation preference clauses. But one of the most basic and the most standard clause that we see in most deals today is one which entitles an investor or a preference shareholder to the higher of 1x of their investment amount or their pro rata entitlement in the company on a fully diluted basis. Now, what do we mean in simple terms of what is pro rata entitlement on a fully diluted basis? This is primarily the shareholding of the investor in the company on the assumption that all the shares, including the preference shares of the investor, are converted into equity shares. So I think given that liquidation preference involves a certain amount of understanding of numbers, let me just share my screen to take you through some basic examples of how a liquidation preference clause is played out. I hope everybody can see my screen. So let's just run through the standard clause that I just explained to you. So let's look at this example. Investor A has invested 10,000 USD for 20% shareholding in the company. Investor B has invested 30,000 USD for a 10% shareholding in a company. So total investment is 40,000 USD. And the company has done well, and over a couple of years, there's a liquidation event, the proceeds of which are USD 100,000. So now let's see the basic clause which I explained to you all, which is higher of 1x or pari passu, how it plays out for both these investors who came in at different price points for different stakes in the company. The 1x return of investor A would be 10,000 and 1x return for investor B would be 30,000. Now let's look at pari passu return. Pari passu would be 20% of 100,000 for investor A, which is 20,000. And for investor B, who had only gotten 10% stake in the company, it will be 10% of 100,000, which is 10,000. So as can be seen, investor A would get a pari passu right of 20,000 as a liquidation preference amount, whereas investor B will choose the 1x return, since that's higher than the pari passu amount. So depending on at which stage each investor has come in, typically this is how an liquidation preference clause will be played out. Moving on, let me also just discuss the different types of liquidation preference that are generally built into the standard clause. So the first point I would like to discuss is a participating liquidation preference and a non-participating liquidation preference. Now, participating liquidation preference can also be is also called a double dip liquidation preference. What it exactly does is that it entitles an investor for their 1x return and thereafter to participate in the remaining proceeds on their pari passu or converted basis. So this is not a promoter friendly clause and it is heavily in favor of the investors. So typically in deals today, in like what we do currently, we do not see a participating liquidation preference clause. Let's look at an example to understand this in terms of numbers. So taking the same investment example, which is seen above on the screen, let's see how investor A's liquidation preference amount will be played out had he had a participating liquidation preference. So if it was a participating liquidation preference clause, investor A would first get his 1x return, which is 10,000, and thereafter he would participate with the remaining amount. So that would be 20% of 90,000, which is 18,000. So as you can see, when there's a participating liquidation preference clause, investor A would get 28,000, whereas when there's no participation preference clause, like our first example, investor A would have only been entitled to 20,000. That differential amount of 8,000 is primarily what would have been taken away from common shareholders. So typically, we do not see this clause in most investment deals today. Now, the second type of liquidation preference clause we've seen is with respect to seniority structures. So in the past, depending on the stage at which you invested, the investor would have a preference over other investors as well. So for example, a Series D investor would have a liquidation preference clause and a liquidation preference over and above a Series A and a Series B investor. But again, today, what we see in most documents in India is that all investors have an equal right. So irrespective of what stage you had come in, whether it's Series D, late stage, or early stage Series A, all of you have an equal right so far as liquidation preference is concerned. But in other jurisdictions such as UK, we still see this seniority structure where some later stage shareholders are given preference over early stage shareholders. Now, the third type of difference in a liquidation preference that we have seen is one with respect to multiples. So typically today in most deals, we see that an investor's liquidation preference, the bottom threshold that is protected is typically just 1x of their investment amount. That is, as long as they should try and get what they invested. But a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, it was very common to see even 2x and 3x multiples being built in. But in most investment deals that we see in India today, it is the 1x amount which is generally provided. Now, the example that I showed you all is, just one moment. So the examples that I've showed you all here play out very well when the proceeds from liquidation event are sufficient to meet everyone's returns and also have some for the common shareholders. But a couple of times, the liquidation event amount is not sufficient. And this is a concept that is also built into the shareholders agreement. So what happens when your liquidity event amount is not sufficient to meet the investment amount of the investors? Let's explore this through an example. So investor A had invested 60,000 USD for 20% shareholding in the company. Thereafter, investor B invested 20,000 USD for a 5% stake in the company. And after a few years, the company did not perform as well as these investors expected. So if you look at the total investment amount, it is 80,000. However, the liquidity event, the proceeds available are only 50,000. So what happens in this situation? So in this situation, typically what we have seen in liquidation preference clauses in shareholders agreements is that since the 1x return of 80,000 can't be met, the entire amount of 50 is distributed pro rata amongst investor A and investor B basis their investment amount. So in essence, since investor A invested 60,000, they would be entitled to 37,500, whereas investor B, who had invested only 20,000, would be entitled to 12,500. This is a basic calculation of 60,000 by 80,000 into the liquidity event amount, which is 50,000. So this is what we typically see. So, and the common shareholders and the promoters would not get anything in this situation since the company has not performed well. So these are, let me just stop sharing. So as we could see from the different examples, these are the standard and typical sort of liquidation clauses that we see. The examples I took were simple. Understand the basic concepts, but as more investors come in at different prices, and when sometimes down rounds happen and then thereafter again there are high rounds, there are a few complications on how the liquidation event and the proceeds will eventually play out. But like Atikant had mentioned, typically how a liquidation preference clause, there's no straitjacket fixed liquidation clause. It would be negotiate how it is finally put into the shareholders agreement would be based on the bargaining powers of the party, that is how strong the promoters are, how well the company is doing, how early stage this investment is, or it's whether it's a late stage investment. So taking all these into considerations, different parties have drafted different liquidation preference clauses. Some of the clauses further tweak the examples that I've given you so that it is more in favor of promoters, and it's not that even when there's a great exit, the promoters are left with the of the pie. Over to you.
Thank you, Anu. Places where we have actually seen people use participant preferred, again, as Anusha mentioned, it's very rarely used. It's not very common. But in some cases where I have seen is where the valuation is very high. The private equity is willing to give a higher valuation if they get participating preferred because they are the first one who can get the money out, which means their risk of giving higher valuation is low. Because not just they get the money out, but then they also participate in the upside. So they feel that if I give higher valuation, it is fine, and if company really wants a very high valuation, then they may end up giving participating preferred. So that's the situation where we have seen participating preferred being used. But in most cases, it's not used. Thank you, Anusha. It was very clear and detailed explanation. Let us move to Parag. Parag, why don't you tell whether liquidation preference and the triggers such as drag rights, etc., are valid under Indian Contract Act? Is it something which, and Companies Act, which is something which we can actually consider it to be legal?
So, in terms of whether these rights are valid under the Indian Contract Act and Companies Law and certain related provisions, I think I will just briefly touch upon, under the Contract Act, that what is a valid contract, and accordingly, anything that is any agreement which is a valid contract should be enforceable under the terms of the law, unless subject to certain exceptions, which I'll also touch upon. So, from a Contract Act perspective, the key aspects for a contract to be enforceable is that, there should be free consent of the parties. There should be a lawful consideration between the parties that should be passed on. The contract should be for a lawful object, and, the provisions of the Contract Act and other laws should not declare such contract to be expressly to be void or invalid, right? Now there are certain exceptions to this rule of enforceability, which is that it should not be forbidden by law, or it should not be regarded by court as being opposed to public policy. There are certain other aspects also which I'm not getting into because they are not relevant for the purpose of this discussion, right? Now if we see, right, whether it's the first key aspect being whether these contracts are forbidden by law, right? So if you look at the Companies Act, right, there is nothing that expressly prohibits a liquidation preference, or as we mentioned, the drag rights that we in typical examples in situations in which these rights liquidation preference is used. In fact, Companies Act inherently provides for kind of a liquidation preference for a preference share in certain limited situations, which being the winding up or liquidation of the company, right? So there is, from a Companies Act perspective, there is no bar on a liquidation preference, and in certain ways it's enables it, right? Then with respect to the drag along rights, the enforceability or validity of the drag along right from a Companies Act perspective, right? So there has been jurisprudence which has developed by the court. Earlier the view of the court was that if there is a disconnect, or if there is the provisions of the SHA and articles are in conflict with each other, in that case there may be an issue on enforceability of a right under the shareholders agreement. So typically all the rights should be incorporated in the articles, but later on, including in the Vodafone case, the Supreme Court went on to held that it may be possible that the rights are not aligned in both the documents, but as long as the SHA is not inconsistent with the articles, you should be able to still enforce it, right? So from that perspective, but more often than not, you will see investors and their counsels ensuring that all these rights, drag rights, and management rights, etc., which are part of the SHA, are duly incorporated in the articles to avoid any sort of confusion or interpretation issue later on, right? Another point to touch upon from a drag along perspective is, while for a private company, inherently private company can have transfer restrictions incorporated, inbuilt, in the documents or the articles, and but for a public company, there was an issue earlier, in terms of whether a transfer restriction can be imposed with respect to a public company, and especially with respect to the Securities on Contract Regulation Act 1956, which deals with purchase or sale of securities, or prohibits sale of purchase of securities in certain situations. But as I mentioned, that SCRA actually applies only to public companies and not private companies. So most of the VC deals which are in the private company space actually don't get affected by it. But it's helpful to briefly touch upon this discussion. SCRA from a enforceability perspective. So what SCRA earlier said was that that any sale of security should be on a spot delivery basis, which means that actual delivery of securities and the payment of price should happen either on the same day of the contract or the next day. This actually created an issue with enforceability of optionality clauses such as tag rights, call options, drag rights, and because they couldn't meet the requirements of a spot delivery contract. However, in 2014, SEBI came out with a notification where they expressly permitted certain kind of rights to be enforced, such as right of first refusal, tag along, or drag along rights, which were kind of in the nature of an optionality clause, and they don't meet the test of the spot delivery. But because it was expressly permitted by SEBI, by the government, for a public company, for a private company, automatically, while there's no prohibition, it just added credibility to the argument that even in a private company contract, there is no fetter on the enforceability of these provisions. Over to you, Baru.
Thank you, Parag. There have been multiple questions on today's session, and there are three questions, one by Hemant, SR, and Divyang, which talks about why CCPS and why not equity, and if you have an equity shares, can they can you have a contractual liquidation preference right now? This is a very interesting question. um, going to what Parag said, right, that if as long as a valid contract, it should be enforceable, right? Keeping aside foreign investor for a moment and whether it is enforceable under FEMA on or not is let's keep it on the side for now. But if two classes of equity shares, if there are equity shares of both, and if you are agreed to have a different valuation, because along with equity shares there is also certain additional rights which are being passed, right? So if there's a contractual right, then it may be able to enforce under a contract, not under Companies Act, right? So for example, if there's a liquidity event by dissolving a company, in which case CCPS may get a higher valuation compared to equity shares. But if both equity shares, two shareholders own equity shares, then you can't really say that there is a additional or preference of one equity shareholder with another equity shareholder. But under contract, you may be able to ask the other equity shareholder to hand over some portion of agreed amount to you. So it is possible to do so. Having said it, it is not tested, right? That's one reason why CCPSs are mainly used, because it improves the ability to get better liquidation preference. Now, even CCPS, whether you will get liquidation preference under Companies Act, again, it's not tested. At least in my knowledge, specifically because it is CCPS and not just preference shares. When it comes to, let's say, foreign investor, can Reserve Bank of India actually ask them to convert, because you need to convert it before, you can't really take it as a debt, so you need to convert it. So can you ask as conversion and then do the liquidation? Is that something which is possible? I have not seen it tested, so I can't answer to that. But if you have CCPS, it may be possible to get liquidation preference if Reserve Bank of India doesn't take this issue, but otherwise it may not be able to. You will have to convert into equity shares and get the same level under Companies Act in terms of liquidation of a company. But contractually, you may be able to do, keeping aside the exchange control regulation for a moment. With this, Parag, let me go back and ask you questions on regulatory issues around liquidation preference. Other regulatory issues around liquidation preference. Can you take it up?
We briefly touched upon some of those regulatory issues, but I'll just discuss some other aspects of it and touch upon those things in detail. So see, I think the key regulatory issues that come with in respect of enforcing a liquidation preference provision, right, is typically when the sale is a distress sale, or there is not enough money in the sale to be distributed among the shareholders, because as Atikant and Anusha had mentioned, right, that the investor can participate either to get back their investment amount, or participate, let go of that preference to get the investment amount and participate with all the other shareholders on a pari passu basis, right? Now, where there is enough amount to be distributed amongst everyone, typically no one will exercise their preference. Everyone would want to participate on an as if converted basis, assuming they have converted their shares to equity, and then basis whatever is their shareholding, people will take the money out, right? But where there's a distress sale, and there may be a situation where for different investors, or in case of one investor, they may have to exercise their liquidation preference and would not want to participate with the promoters on basis their shareholding. I think the key regulatory issues come under that scenario, right? So now, what is the basis of these regulatory issues is, I think most of our participants will be aware of it, but I will just briefly touch upon it. Is whenever a foreign investor, right, is buying shares from a person, is buying shares from a resident, or selling shares to a resident, pricing guidelines will apply in that case, right? So in case the foreign investor is selling shares to a domestic buyer, right? In that case, the issue is that they cannot receive anything which is above the fair market value of those shares, right? Fair market value is typically determined using any of the internationally recognized methodologies like discounted cash flow or net asset value, and it has to be supported by a certificate by the chartered accountant, right? And the problem in this case will happen is because the non-resident shareholder may have to take more money per share, receive more money per share as compared to the founders, right? So, and because they are limited by this whole concept of FMV, which has to be determined by a third party, sometimes, actually it's not sometimes, most of the times, the terms of the shares, and as you said, preference shares is a better way to receive this liquidation preference. The terms of the preference shares inherently incorporate a liquidation preference, and that right in the terms of the shares, which actually may justify receiving a higher price per share as compared to the set of shares that are held by the founders being equity shares, which don't have these inbuilt liquidation preference, right? Another issue which actually I think is a settled position, but there was some doubt around it, was whether a liquidation preference can be deemed to be an assured return, because what our exchange control regulations provide is that a non-resident investor should not be able to exit the company at an assured return. There was some history behind it, how this law developed, right? And basically the main idea behind this law was that earlier and till now also, actually, which we discussed yesterday, that the investors have these optionality clauses to exit, right? They can have a buyback against the company or a put option against the promoter, at which they can ask the company or the promoter to buy their shares. Now the question is, if they earlier, what used to happen was the investors would require the company or the promoter to buy the shares at a particular price, which will give them an assured return, right? RBI did a change on these provisions. In 2014, they came out with a notification stating that there cannot be any exit by the non-resident investors with an assured return, and they can only sell their shares in an FMV. But if you look at these things, first of all, in our view, that liquidation preference actually is not an assured return. It's more of an allocation between the shareholders to receive that money, right? Secondly, typically, if you see the RBI restriction, it's vis-a-vis the company and the promoter, that they should not be forced to pay the investor a particular agreed amount of money. In a situation, typically when we enforce liquidation preference, it's more often than not against a third party, which is more of a negotiated sale. So the investor cannot really force the third party to pay a particular price, and eventually depending on the residency of the third party, it's anyways will be done at at a negotiated price. Just one more thing which I forgot to mention, actually, if the buyer is a non-resident, then with respect to the non-resident investor, there'll be no issue in terms of a fair market value or a pricing. But there the issue that will come up is with respect to the Indian promoters, because then the non-resident investor will have to pay the Indian promoter at least the fair market value of the securities, and it cannot be less than that, right? I think one more issue that typically comes up, see how these provisions are drafted is, if for some reason, right, the investor is not able to receive the liquidation preference on account of any regulatory issue, then the promoters will be transferring the money that they have received to the investor, so that the investor gets the liquidation preference amount that it desires, right? A slight problem in this regard from a tax perspective will be, because when you sell the shares and receive money for it, you pay capital gains tax on it, which depending on long term, short term, can vary between 10% to 40% for a non-resident investor. And more often than not, you'll see non-resident investors, especially coming from Mauritius, Singapore, getting treaty benefits for it. However, in this case where the promoter is transferring the money to the investor, it will not be treated as a capital account transaction, and it will be more in the nature of a compensation or a kind of a damages. So what will happen in this case is the investor will end up actually paying 40% tax for a non-resident investor, and on that sale, as opposed to a lower rate in case of a capital gain situation. So I think Vaibhav, my next question is to you. With respect to Vaibhav, so practically, how in which situations, what practical issues in enforcing a liquidation provision, preference provision we have seen, more so in a drag scenario, where basically the entire company is being sold, at the instance of the investor, and how do these actually play out in real life scenario?
Yeah. Okay, I will address it, Parag, but this is a question I wanted to ask Ali Pak, who is our litigation expert. But let me address it on a broader level, and on the enforcement side, I will ask Ali Pak to kind of add in, right? As we talked about liquidation preference, right? And I don't know if there our call yesterday, we said that we will also address the drag and strategic sale in this particular session, and I just thought I will touch upon that a little bit, interweave how the liquidation preferences kind of works, and then go to Ali Pak and ask on the litigation enforcement side whether this is really enforceable or not, or what are the issues in enforcing. So if you really look at it, we have seen liquidation preference on two situations. One is strategic sale side, where parties are willing to go and sell, and other is drag situation, where investor does not get an exit and he's looking to drag all the other shareholders, right, in trying to get an exit. And he says, I'm going to drag, and I'm also going to enforce my liquidation preference so that I get larger amount of returns compared to the other shareholders as differential amount. Primarily, this is a scenario where the company is not doing well and is not getting all shareholders are not getting money as planned, right? Now, just give some examples. If you see from what I read in public information, Snapdeal was trying to sell it to Flipkart, and it was kind of a strategic sale. It was not envisaged as drag rights, but it was driven by SoftBank primarily. And this is a pressure which investor had put in to go and sell it to Flipkart. And at least what we hear from public sources, right? So we don't know. We're not privy to the inside information, but what we heard from public sources is SoftBank was also looking to enforce some of the rights, liquidation preference rights, and as a result, what was on table for the promoters or founders and some of the early investor was nothing. It's peanuts, and as a result, they actually couldn't conclude the sale to Flipkart. So if you look at practical situation, that if you find some promoters or early investors not getting anything or getting very, very less amount, in which case you don't get that cooperation. If you don't get that cooperation, you may not be able to go and conclude the sale successfully. So what we have seen is that even though you have a liquidation preference right, and your liquidation preference will say I will get all the money, and promoter and early investor may not get any money. But if you really want to enforce, you still may need to sit on a negotiating table at that point of time, trying to use your strategic sale or drag rights, whatever rights you have, as a leverage, and try to come with a situation where you get the cooperation of all the sellers. In which case it becomes easy for you to conclude the transaction. Otherwise, you will need to go, if they're non-cooperative, then you need to go and try to seek enforcement, and we'll see how the enforcement actually works. Similarly, if you look at from drag rights perspective, I had another case where investors were actually looking to drag someone. Uh, Again, in this case, the founders and some of the early investors or some of the investors were not cooperating, so they wanted to drag them out. And these are later stage investors. And again, we ended up seeing similar situation where if you start dragging someone and they simply refuse to drag, what will you do? You will go to the court. If you go to the court, it takes time. Can you actually enforce it? Is it the timeline which is which it takes to actually enforce it? Is it something which the investor who wants to drag okay with, in a sense that, does it really make sense to them to wait so much to get what they are looking for, or is there other alternatives? So all those discussion points go into situation to decide whether you're going to use drag rights with liquidation preference or not. With this, let me go to Alipak, and maybe if there are certain things I want to add, I will add after Alipak answers. He is our litigation team member, senior litigation team member. So, Alipak, can you tell us possible challenges in enforcement of liquidation preference?
Sure, Vaibhav. Thank you for that. I think first let's look at, as the name suggests, what happens in case of a liquidation of a corporate debtor, that is the investee company. I think first let's look at that, and then I'll consider and I'll discuss the other events which we just discussed, and that will also answer a few questions which have been asked. So in case of liquidation, in case of initiation of corporate insolvency process under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016, as soon as the insolvency gets accepted, there is a moratorium which starts operating pursuant to Section 14 of the Act. And once the moratorium kicks in, that basically prohibits transferring, encumbering, alienating, or disposing of any assets or any legal rights, beneficial rights. So once that moratorium kicks in, then there is no scope for enforcing such kind of clause. Now, what happens after the moratorium is implemented? Thereafter, the transaction is put in the schedule or the prospectus, and the resolution applicant who bids for the distressed company, he gets an opportunity to decide how that transaction will be dealt with. Assuming the resolution process works and the resolution applicant files a successful plan and it is approved by the NCLT, well, very well, you get something out of it. If the plan does not work, then the company goes into liquidation. And then under that scheme, Section 53 of the Insolvency Code kicks in. And under Section 53, a waterfall mechanism has been prescribed, where first you allocate the insolvency cost, then you go to the workman dues, debt owed to the secured creditors, wages to employees, so on and so forth. So the last and the second last leg is the preference shareholders and the equity shareholders. In our experience, we see they basically get nil, zero payment. So to summarize, in the actual case of a liquidation of a corporate debtor, even if you have such kind of a clause, you will not be able to enforce it. Now, this brings me to the other aspect. What happens in the case of other liquidity events, which we just discussed and which Atikant explained? Now, we have not seen too many such cases in India. But as Parag mentioned, typically these clauses will have a stipulated percentage of return, could be 1x, could be 2x, or could be a certain percentage above the fair market value. And we have had cases where such kind of clauses have been interpreted by the courts, and I'll discuss two of them for the purposes of the present presentation. Now let's again look at the pricing guideline. So clause 21 of pricing guideline basically stipulates that a resident cannot sell to a non-resident. Basically, an Indian promoter will not be able to sell it to a foreign investor at a price, can only sell at a price which is arrived at by the internationally accepted pricing methodology, which typically is DCF, discounted cash flow mechanism, and that has to be certified by a chartered accountant. So then how does that operate as against the clause which you have in an investment agreement, which prescribes 2x or 3x return? So that is the conflict and that is the defense which a promoter would take, and that is the potential litigation issue which we see in a lot of cases. Now, just a background. So in an investment agreement where there's a litigation, most of these clauses will have an arbitration clause. It could be CEAC, it could be ICC, it could be LCIA. So you will be before an arbitral tribunal to explain your case, and then you'll get an award on this issue. Now, two such instances which I will discuss. The first case is Cruise City versus Unitech Limited. Now, this was a case where this was a London-seated arbitration. It did not have a liquidity event clause, but it had a clause where if the real estate project, which was the substance of the investment agreement, if that did not commence, then the investor could trigger an exit right, which gave about 15 to 18% internal rate of return. Now, the award was published. The award was granted in favor of the foreign investor. Subsequently, the matter was challenged before the Delhi High Court, and certain observations of the High Court are very interesting, which possibly, if one looks at it, one could possibly see that these kind of clauses should be enforceable in India. But the High Court, of course, before the High Court, the respondent took the plea that these clauses are not enforceable under the FEMA Act, and it would be opposed to public policy of India. Now, just to give a background, for a foreign award to be enforceable in India, it cannot be challenged, but it can be resisted. There's a slight difference. For resisting enforcement, the grounds are even narrower. For challenging it, you could do that in Indian seated award. Now, one could resist a foreign award if it is opposed to public policy of India. So the courts looked at it. They said that the contravention of any provision of an enactment is not synonymous to contravention of fundamental policy of Indian law. The expression fundamental policy of Indian law refers to principles and legislative policy on which Indian statutes and laws are founded. So they basically held that fundamental policy is at a very high pedestal. While there could be a non-compliance with FEMA, but that will not nullify the arbitral award. And then it also held that the optionality clause granting assured return on FDI are proscribed. However, it is doubtful whether the said circular will be applicable to cases where a foreign investor found its claim in breach of the contract. Plainly, if an investment is made on representation which are breached, the investor would be entitled to its remedies, including in damage. The second case, and then the award was enforced. Unfortunately, what happened after the award was enforced, Unitech went into insolvency, and then the matter is stuck there at this point. The next case which I wanted to discuss was Tata Docomo case. Again, in this case, there was a price involved in the transaction document, and there was a lengthy litigation before in London. Pursuant to that, Tata resisted the enforcement before the Delhi High Court against Docomo. And in fact, in this case, RBI also filed an intervention application, and they contended that you can't give effect to this kind of an award that would be contrary to FEMA. The High Court said that RBI did not have the standing to challenge the award between two private parties, and the tribunal has correctly determined the issue. What was awarded to Docomo were damages and not the price of the share. So the courts have gone on the premise that because of a material event or because of a default, these clauses tend to take the nature of a damage, and it cannot be said that these are strictly share transactions. Now, these are the two examples that we have in our hand. I'll take another 1 more minute. Like I said, these cases are typically referred to arbitration, and in last 7 to 8 years, we have hardly seen any case where an arbitral award has been successfully resisted, which is to say, if you have a dispute and if the arbitrator grants you the relief, 99% of the chance that will be enforced by Indian courts. If arguments on FEMA and public policy violations are brought before the courts are declining to accept that argument. They say that RBI may have an issue. That's for them to decide. But on these principles, award will not be set aside. I think I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alipak. I think you have covered quite succinctly the the enforcement aspect, specifically if it goes into arbitration and also it goes into liquidation. I think we have about 9 minutes left, and I would rather use this time for taking up some questions. I wanted to add few things, but maybe I will cover in questions if it comes up. Uh, First question, Parag. Let me ask you. I think it's an interesting question by Yashodhara. I think her question is with respect to. I'm sorry, there are so many questions. It takes time for me to go to that question. Uh, can you? He says, can she asks, can you share your experience on liquidation preferences in bridge round and venture debt round? Parag, can you quickly, briefly answer that? If you have any response on this, any thoughts on this?
So see, from a venture debt perspective, right? It again, see, depends what is the, because see, venture debt, just to explain everyone briefly, it's a debt that typical startups take from certain venture debt investors, right? Where while the debt is taken at a agreed rate of interest, but because of the lack of security, etc., and the risk that the investor is taking, there is also an upside for the risk that the investor is taking. So in order to compensate or achieve that upside, investors typically take shares. Again, those shares are preference shares which are linked to the, or akin, having similar rights to the latest round of funding that the company has received, right? So more often than not, those shares will have the same pref, and there is, in order to avoid any negotiation, and because typically these companies which receive venture debt already have venture capital investors who have negotiated these rights. Even the venture debt investor takes the same set of preference shares with slight variation, but in terms of liquidation preference, it will still follow the same principle as that is for the venture capital investors. So they do have a liquidation preference because of the CCPS or preference shares that they subscribe.
And also to add, the debt part anyway is above the liquidation preference, which means that they will get the debt before they get part of the other things, right? Other shareholders debt. Okay. Let me go to a question by Sunita. Anusha, can you take it up? Her question is, when LP proceeds aren't sufficient, uh, I think sufficient, as you mentioned, that proceeds are divided as per investment amount. This doesn't take into account the earlier stage investor who may have not invested huge amount but have taken higher risk and hence have higher stake. Can LP proceeds be distributed pro rata to the stake and not to the base of investment amount? Does that occur? Should SHA cover for that? Anusha, you want to take it?
As I explained through the example, when your funds are not sufficient, they are distributed pro rata to your investment amount. So what Sunita is primarily asking is that an early stage investor, although they invested only 10,000 USD, they probably have a 30% stake, whereas a late stage investor who's invested 30,000 USD might have just a 5% stake. So shouldn't the early stage investor also benefit, shouldn't this distribution be based on percentage shareholding and not investment amount? So the idea is that when your funds are not sufficient, we are not looking at an upside for any one investors. When funds are not sufficient, the way investors look at it is that how do we ensure that all of them at least recuperate as close to 1x their investment amount as possible. So given that this is a principle and not that one investor who has taken an early risk is given an upside, typically we've seen that all proceeds when it's insufficient are basis investment amount. Having said that, as this is a contractual clause, it's a negotiated clause. If investors can negotiate, if early stage investors can negotiate and have this basis as stake, there's nothing which in law which is preventing such distribution.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anusha. Alipak, there are two questions. One question is asking for citation of Delhi High Court judgment. If you can just share it on the chat window, that will be good. Or you can take it offline if you don't have it right now. Second question is when you talked about insolvency. The question is on voluntary liquidation. Will it be enforceable? Can you take this up, Alipak?
Sure. I think it has not been tested as yet. Although in a voluntary liquidation per se, that's a lenient procedure. I think a lot of processes which is involved in the normal thing that will not apply. It has not been tested, so it is still a gray area. We have not seen any case law on that as yet.
Okay, thank you. Maybe one more question we can take. It's by Divyang. In a private company in India, Class A equity share could be ₹1, which is at stage 0, and Class B could be ₹10 or more. And yet, right to vote could be as per number of equity share which person holds. Okay, I think this is not a question. I don't see a question. Yeah, I don't see a question here. Okay, we'll take. I think I'll take one more because we don't have time. There are too many questions. Would preference shareholder be considered as financial creditor under new insolvency and bankruptcy code, or will they fall in line with equity shareholders of the company? Alipak, you want to take this up?
So I think the question is, are preference shares holders treated as financial creditors under the insolvency and bankruptcy code, or they're treated at par with the equity shareholders?
So as things stands today, we don't have a Supreme Court judgment on that. But then there are such NCLTs which have held that they can be treated as financial creditors. But NCLAT as well as Supreme Court, there's no ruling on that. So it still remains a very gray area.
And Alipak, just to add, if you see the waterfall under the IBC, right, it's a preference shareholder as separate from a financial creditor. So you'll need
correct.
Though they are above the equity shareholders, but not.
It is above. Yeah, it is above the equity shareholder, but then again, even on one or two instances that they have considered, the facts and circumstances are very different. There was a time-bound agreement. The contract had to be performed in 2 or 3 years. Those cases, you can't take out a ratio out of those cases. These are 1 or 2 page non-reasoned orders.
Thank you, everyone. I know there are more questions. We can take that offline. We are running out of time. Over to you, Dian. Thank you, participant. I really appreciate all your questions and you attending this session.